All right, so today I will be presenting the project that I and a couple of colleagues did about a decade ago when we took this class. And this is just an example presentation for you guys to see what all you should be including and talking about in your presentation, and to see how an example is done in terms of discussing the results. And so what we decided to do was to look at sex offender treatment effectiveness, and we wanted to look at this as it was defined by recidivism, as that's how the majority of the literature in this area looks at treatment effectiveness with this population. And we had an interesting question that had not been answered yet in the literature. There was quite a debate as to whether or not treatment was effective, of course, but beyond that, there had not been an answer as to whether or not treatment was more effective in a particular setting. So we wanted to analyze institutional-based settings versus community-based. All right. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction, the current literature regarding the effectiveness of sex offender treatment programs still remains ambiguous in terms of the results. And our present study contributes to this existing literature to try and provide an answer to this question that still remains in our field. And so in investigating this topic, we generated 3 problem statements to investigate in more detail. And so we wanted to focus on how effective is treatment in reducing recidivism among male sex offenders. Secondly, we wanted to know, was there a difference in treatment outcome between community-based and institutional-based settings? And then third, we wanted to investigate which of these programs are most effective for reducing recidivism rates over a longer period of time. So in describing the method, the characteristics of the studies that we looked at. So again, remembering that this particular meta-analysis examined the relationship between treatment effectiveness and recidivism among adult male sex offenders, and we wanted to limit the analysis of research conducted since 1980. And this limitation was expected in order to facilitate analysis of the most current research that was available. We did not want to go back before 1980 because we felt that that was just too dated with how advanced cognitive behavioral therapy has become, especially in 1980 and beyond. And this, we thought, should result in a review of the majority of the mainstream sex offender literature as we know that to be today. So in our process of searching for eligible studies, we completed a library database search using EBSCOhost as our main database that included all of those databases within EBSCOhost. And we used a number of key terms. Granted, the words that you see listed here on the slide weren't the exact key terms that we used because we used an asterisk and a manipulation of that word to get as many results as possible based on those minor switches in the word. But the basics of our key terms included sex offender, treatment, effective, and recidivism. And each study was reviewed, and to be included, treatment effectiveness had to be defined in terms of recidivism. So recidivism had to have been defined as either a violation of parole, readmittance to an institution, the defendant had to have been rearrested, reconvicted, There could have been lapses in behavior, which one article described this as being willfully and elaborately fantasizing about sexual offending or engaging in any sources of stimulation that's associated with sexual offending, having multiple outcomes, or any combination of the aforementioned after treatment had concluded. The recidivism rates were obtained from a variety of sources that could include probation and parole records, verification through either probation or parole officers, public records, so for instance, national criminal justice records or state and provincial records, and then additional sources of information were also acceptable, so perhaps child protection records and or self-reports from the offenders. And studies were limited to a particular type of recidivism. So we only focused on sexual recidivism. So if there were studies that only described general or violent types of recidivism, those would have been excluded from our meta-analysis. So in setting for our criteria for inclusion, the studies that qualified to be included in our meta included those that utilized treatments for adult male sex offenders in a community or an institutionalized setting. The reported recidivism rates of a treated sex offender sample had to have been compared with a control group. So they had to have a treatment group as well as a control group. And the nature of the control groups could have been a number of different things. So they could have been receiving treatment as usual. So it could have been a sex offender specific treatment program that they were enrolled in. They could have been waitlisted. They could have received non-sex offender specific treatment, or they could have received no treatment at all as a control group assignment. And we wanted similar recidivism criteria to be used for both the treatment and the comparison groups. And they had to have had comparable follow-up periods. So we wanted them to be in sort of the same time frame. So we wanted them to be comparing the treatment and control groups at similar time frames. So between 5 and 6 years, typically, instead of looking at 6 months with one group and 10 years with the other group, because that doesn't give us a really good comparison of treatment versus control. And you'd be amazed at what some studies decide to do for follow-ups with treatment versus control because of the access to those different groups differs. And we required that treatment programs should include at least 6 participants in the combined sample, and they had to have provided predominantly psychological treatment. So any studies that used a variety of forms of medication as the predominant treatment method weren't eligible. And then, of course, studies should have reported an effect size or provided us with enough data for us to be able to calculate an effect size in order to be included. And so throughout the course of our literature search, we found 1,230 articles that we received hits on, and we looked through the study's titles at the title level. Then we narrowed them down to the abstract level, and ultimately, for the purposes of this course, 15 studies met our specified inclusion criteria. And in looking at the moderator analysis that we did, just to give you an idea of how evenly split our articles were, in one of our problem statements was looking at institutional versus community-based. We had a really nice split. So we had 8 articles looking at institutional treatment and 7 looking at community-based treatment. And so looking at our coding process, We developed a subject-specific coding manual that was used in order to code each study, and we included a number of coding variables. So we wanted to track some study information in order to be able to identify each study. So some of those things included tracking the year, the type of publication it was, the location the study occurred, the citation, things like that. We also coded sample descriptors, so some of these types of codes were the mean age of the sample, the predominant race, and the treatment setting. We also included research design descriptors, so we wanted to be able to code the treatment and the control conditions, and also the sample frequency data. We coded the nature of the treatment descriptors, so the type of treatment that the offenders were receiving, and then the treatment orientation. And then also we wanted to code dependent measure descriptors. So this was our recidivism data and the source that the recidivism data came from. And in order for us to ensure that our coding was reliable, we employed an inter-rater reliability process, and that meant that the three of us used a blind coding process. So each of us individually evaluated 5 articles, and then each of us also blind coded 5 articles. So we each coded 10 articles in this process. And of course, blind coding, we were coding blind to the initial coder's coding. So it was as if we were the initial coder. And we met to discuss any discrepancies and decided on those final codes and carried those forward into our analysis. For computation of our effect size, in order to calculate our effect size for recidivism rates, the primary statistics that we used was frequency or proportion data. And if we had an instance where the frequency or proportion data wasn't available, then typically the odds ratio or the test statistic data was used as secondary and tertiary methods, respectively. We computed a log odds ratio from the data since a majority of the data that we collected was frequency data, and we know from the class that frequency data will end up with a log odds ratio effect size. We also looked at heterogeneity, and we computed our Q statistic, and we wanted to know that if all cognitive behavioral treatment if it's administered in a similar nature, hopefully we would think there would be a very small between treatments effect size and low levels of heterogeneity would be anticipated. However, given what we know about psychological treatment, we know inevitably that there is going to be some heterogeneity just due to the nature of how folks are different as therapists, how different clinics implement things differently, how different institutions, forensic institutions implement things differently. So we expect there to be some heterogeneity just based on the nature of the topic that we chose to analyze. And then in terms of our subgroup analyses, we looked at 2 different moderators. So we wanted to look at the differences, if there were any, between institutional-based treatment and community-based treatment. And then secondly, we wanted to look at follow-up periods. So was there a difference in effect size for studies where they followed the offender on a short-term basis versus a long-term basis? And the way that we operationally defined short-term versus long-term follow-up was based on what we found in the articles. And more often than not, we were able to categorize short-term as them tracking offenders for 6 years or less, and long-term was more than 6 years for follow-up. And so that's how we ended up operationalizing that. And so again, because of the high likelihood that we anticipated of variability between and among each study, we conducted our analyses within a random effects model. And so to discuss the results that we found. So here we are looking at our figure 1, and this is our forest plot. And what this forest plot shows us is, if you can see here on the left, you can see that we have a number of studies that are included here. So these are all of the studies that were included. And then you can see that we have our odds ratio, so our effect size for each study, which is depicted on the forest plot here by each square. And then we also have the lower and upper limit of the confidence interval of the effect size that are delineated here. We also have the z-value and our p-value. And here on the forest plot, we can see our effect sizes that are graphed here. And to basically interpret what's going on here, this one here is called the line of no effect. And now, since we are looking at an odds ratio, it's important to understand how an odds ratio is interpreted. So an odds ratio is asymmetrical in that on the treatment favored side of the graph, we're looking at 0.01 up until 1. And on the control favored side of the graph, we're looking at from 1 to 100. So there's a lot of variation over here and less variation on this side. And it's just important to keep that in mind when interpreting these numbers in terms of an odds ratio. And what we're seeing here is, more often than not, the boxes that depict the effect size are falling to the left of the line of no effect, which means that it's favoring the treatment. And so this is showing a positive response to treatment. And if you see here, this last line is showing us our summary effect size data. So we have our summary effect size, which was a an odds ratio of 0.550. And then we are also seeing the lower and upper limits to the confidence interval, our z-value and our p-value. And so, looking at our table 1, this summarizes the studies that we included in this meta-analysis, looking at the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy programs on specifically recidivism related to sexual recidivism behaviors. And so we can see that we included these studies here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 studies that were included. And we can see that about half were institution-based and the rest were community-based. We can also see that the treatment, that the N size of each study varied considerably. We can see that the smallest study had 126 offenders, and the largest study had as many as 2,040 offenders, which is a significantly large sample size. We look at the recidivism rates for the treatment and control group, and we can see that for many of these articles, that the control group has a higher percentage of recidivating than the treatment group in most instances. We can also see our odds ratio, so our effect size for each study, and then our confidence interval as well. And looking at Table 2, we can see our summary statistics for the effects of treatment on sex offender recidivism in our meta-analysis. So this looks at our results in the same manner, but looking at it in terms of how we looked at moderator analyses. So we can see that institutional-based treatment settings had an odds ratio of 0.608, and community-based settings had an odds ratio of 0.891. And so what this means is, if we go back to the forest plot, what does that mean in terms of treatment? Well, the closer our odds ratio reaches the number 1, it means it's not as effective. So we want that odds ratio number to be smaller. We want it to be closer to 0 because that means it's ultimately more effective. And so if we go back and look at this, we can see that the institution-based effect size, 0.6, is much smaller than the community-based at 0.89. You can round that to 0.9. And so because it's a smaller effect size, that means it's more supportive of the treatment group. And what we found in terms of follow-up duration, our odds ratio for short-term follow-up was 0.405, and for long-term follow-up, it was 0.698, rounding that up to 0.70. So we can see that offenders typically did better when followed short-term, as they recidivated much more when they were tracked long-term, which we will discuss our hypothesis for that in the discussion a little bit later. And then, of course, you can see our confidence intervals there as well. And this here is our funnel plot. So this is our figure 2. And what we're looking at here is our log odds ratio and plotting our standard error. And we're looking at the Duval and Tweedy's trim and fill analysis. And essentially what the computer is looking for is it's looking for any missing studies to the right of the mean, because we want to look for studies that are less effective, that are probably hidden in someone's file drawer, that weren't published because they didn't have significant results, or they had a really small sample size that were trending towards significant, that just weren't as important and not considered publishable at that time. And so the computer looked for any missing studies, and what it found was the necessity to trim 3 studies. And the reason we see that is because we've plotted our observed values, which are in white circles, and also our imputed values, which are in red circles. And what you can see here is the 3 red circles are mirroring these 3 white circles on that side. So what the computer decided to do was to trim these 3 studies that were highly significant on the treatment side and bring them over to the control side and essentially plug them in there so these cancel one another out. And what ended up happening was the summary effect size that was a 0.550 had to be shifted just slightly to make up for the slight publication bias that was found, necessitating trimming 3 studies. And so what does this mean overall? So let's review what we found. So the results from our meta indicated that from the studies that we analyzed, institutionally based sex offender treatment appeared to be more effective when it was compared to community-based treatment. And more specifically, we found that institutionally based treatment settings had a smaller percentage of offenders who recidivated than those that were in community-based treatment settings. And in terms of follow-up periods, long-term follow-up showed a higher rate of offenders that recidivated in both institutional and community-based settings. And so this was actually to be expected, because if you follow an offender for a longer period of time, inevitably that's going to increase the opportunity for someone to reoffend. So in a sense, these results were expected. So what could this mean in terms of clinical implications? So our results actually suggest that community-based sex offender treatment is not sufficient as a treatment by itself. And it suggests that offenders should at least also be receiving treatment before they are discharged into the community, hinting that they should be getting institutional-based treatment. But we do know from some of the articles that we analyzed, and just from the nature of the sex offender treatment population, that not all folks agree to participate in sex offender treatment and actually refuse it while in settings. And so it's not something that can always be mandated depending on the protocols of that particular facility. So again, it's suggested that offenders should receive treatment institutionally before released into the community, minimally. And as treatment gains appear to decline over time, perhaps periodic implementation of treating them again once in the community is needed in order to maintain their treatment gains. And if all sex offenders were mandated to utilize institutionally based sex offender treatment, then given the results that we found, sexual recidivism rates might be significantly reduced with this population if that was the case. And some of the limitations that we would like to note. So most of the studies that we analyzed actually consisted of predominantly Caucasian populations. And as a result, this really doesn't have the ability to generalize our results to other races or cultures. And it's important to note that these results could actually be coming from an inherent cultural bias that is present throughout the sex offender literature. But on the other hand, it could be indicative that most sex offenders are actually Caucasian, because we do know that research has shown that online sex offenders and offenders that are involuntarily committed civilly as SVPs, sexually violent predators, are predominantly Caucasian. The search terms that we used to identify research-based literature for this meta-analysis included articles that defined recidivism in a variety of ways. So that included rearrest, reconviction, reincarceration, recharge, and with including multiple definitions of recidivism, that inherently increases the likelihood of violating the assumption of independent observations. And in addition to that, using multiple definitions of recidivism could lead to overestimating the actual sexual recidivism rate that's calculated, because each definition essentially refers to a different process within the criminal justice system. So estimating someone's recidivism rate based on just being rearrested versus being reconvicted for something look very different. And so it's important to note that limitation. We also want to note that this study analyzed sexual recidivism, and we excluded all other types. So we did not look at general recidivism, and we did not look at violent types of recidivism. So when only looking at sexual recidivism in this study, this limits our ability to examine treatment effectiveness on all types of reoffense. articles included missing data. So some of the articles that we analyzed didn't report data for the entire sample reported, or actually mentioned that some data was missing and couldn't be included. And most of the analyzed articles showed that any treatment decreased recidivism. And what this tells us is that this actually might suggest some publication bias was present, because articles that have been published in peer-reviewed journals do have that greater likelihood to show some treatment effects. And lastly, to comment on a couple of things under the type of analysis that was utilized throughout these studies. So most of the studies ended up using an intention to treat research design that combined dropout data in the treatment group instead of with the treatment completer findings. And so this might affect the subsequent findings due to dropouts actually not meeting a true operational definition of a participant in treatment. And while dropout participants have received some form of treatment, they're also the participants that are most likely to reoffend. And so this could potentially skew the data and give us an underestimation of the effect size. So it's important to note that. And while most of the studies did not use random assignment, it's possible that the differences between treatment and control groups were related to participant characteristics instead of the treatment itself. And in terms of future research ideas, in discussing race, so the distribution of different races within the sex offender population should be considered when conducting research in this area. And studies should really try to attempt to mirror the actual racial distribution of the overall sex offender population so that we can more accurately depict racial diversity as it exists today. And the results could be more generalizable as it relates to treatment effectiveness if we were to get at more of this data at our fingertips. And future studies could benefit from looking at and parceling out specific aspects and methods of CBT specifically as it relates to how it's implemented in sex offender treatment. And this could really help us to better understand what aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy are most effective with this population. And then it might be helpful in future studies to consider separating the dropouts from the treatment group. And in this way, you could look at per protocol analysis, and you could see potentially what an overestimation looked like in the effect size. And even more so, a comparison of intention to treat analysis versus per protocol analysis could even be more informative, because then you could compare the under and overestimation values to one another to further clarify where your level of treatment effectiveness likely lies. And these were the references that we used for our study. And if there are any questions, you can ask me during our final presentation. Thanks, guys.